8,400 pounds. That's what Caleb Dern loaded into the grain truck that Tuesday morning in late October. He'd watched the grain cart display the whole time. He'd written the number on the pad he kept tucked inside the cab. He'd even walked the bin afterward, stuck his measuring rod into the remaining corn, and calculated the difference from the day before. 8,400 pounds. Then the Hartfield Mill and Grain printed his ticket, and the mill ticket said 6,900. Caleb was 17 years old, standing at the window of the elevator office, holding a sheet of paper that said he was wrong by 1,500 pounds. The woman behind the counter, she'd worked there longer than Caleb had been alive, slid the ticket across and told him to have a good afternoon. He looked at that number for a long moment. He didn't say anything. He just folded the ticket, put it in his chest pocket, and drove home. But on the way back, he kept doing the math. 1,500 pounds of corn works out to roughly 27 bushels. At current prices, that was somewhere between $120 and $130. Not a fortune, but that was one load. And if it happened every time he delivered, it added up to something worth caring about. And that was the part he couldn't leave alone. If you've ever been told your numbers were wrong before anyone bothered to check theirs, this story is for you. Subscribe, because the truth here started with a number nobody wanted to question. And drop a comment right now, telling me where in the world you're watching from. Caleb had been farming alongside his grandfather, Del Dern, since he was old enough to ride in the cab. Del had a stroke 3 years back and handed most of the operation to Caleb's father, Harlan, but Harlan drove semi-regionally and was often gone 4 days out of 7. So by harvest, Caleb was the one running the grain cart, managing the bins, and making deliveries to Hartfield Mill and Grain. He wasn't a particularly loud kid. Teachers liked him because he sat near the front and turned things in on time. And on the farm, he'd developed one habit that set him apart from most people his age. He wrote things down, not because anyone told him to. Del had always done it, and Caleb just picked it up. Every load got a notation: date, bin number, grain cart reading, estimated moisture, destination. He had 3 seasons of harvest records in a green spiral notebook he kept in the kitchen drawer, next to the charger cables. When he got home that Tuesday, he pulled it out. He cross-referenced his loading record with the grain cart readings. He checked the beginning and ending levels in bin 4 against his October 21st inventory note. He pulled up moisture data from the sensor his father had installed the previous spring. Everything he had said, 8,400 pounds, give or take a rounding margin. Moisture was running 15.3%, not dramatically high. Certainly nothing that should account for 1,500 pounds vanishing on a 9-mile drive. He called the elevator the next morning. The manager, a stocky man named Greer Albright, who'd been running the Hartfield Mill and Grain facility for 11 years, answered on the 3rd ring. Caleb explained what he'd measured. He explained his moisture reading. He asked, calmly, whether there had been any issue with the scale that day. Greer listened. Then he said, "Son, our scale is certified by the state every single year. What you're describing is probably a calibration difference between your grain cart and a commercial elevator scale. Those grain cart sensors drift. That's just the reality of farm equipment." He wasn't unkind about it. He sounded genuinely patient, the kind of patient you use with someone who doesn't know better yet. Also, Greer added, corn at 15.3% moisture is going to get discounted for shrink. That accounts for some of your difference. Your cart's reading the grain one way, we're reading it another. That's standard. You'll get a feel for it with more seasons under your belt. Caleb thanked him and hung up, and then he sat at the kitchen table and thought about that answer for about 40 minutes, because the answer was almost good enough to believe. Here's what Greer was talking about, and it matters. When grain arrives at an elevator with elevated moisture, the facility applies a shrink factor, a standard deduction because wet grain contains water weight that will evaporate, and the elevator won't pay full price for water. The formula compares incoming moisture to a dry standard, usually around 13 to 14%, and reduces the accepted weight accordingly. At 15.3% moisture, the correct shrink deduction on 8,400 pounds would be somewhere around 100 to 140 pounds, not 1,500. That's where Greer's explanation stopped holding together. Caleb had run the numbers 3 times before he made the phone call. A moisture discount couldn't come close to explaining what that ticket showed. But there was still one possibility he hadn't eliminated: the grain cart sensor. He went to the shed. The grain cart was a 10-year-old model his grandfather had bought second-hand. Caleb checked the weigh system, load cells mounted beneath the cart body that sense tension and convert it to a weight reading. He got down on his back in the dirt, flashlight in hand, and spent 20 minutes examining each cell and the wiring harness connecting them. 2 cells looked clean, but the third, the rear corner one, had a small crack in its protective housing. The wiring inside was intact, but that crack meant the cell had been exposed to moisture and grit for who knows how long. A compromised load cell can drift high, reporting more grain than is actually there. Caleb's stomach dropped. For a moment, he thought Greer had been right, but then he checked his notebook. August soybean loads had all gone to Hartfield and come back with tickets matching his records within 50 to 80 pounds. If the load cell had been badly drifting then, the gap would have shown up. It hadn't. The damaged cell might account for a few hundred pounds, not 1,500. Something else was happening. He sent a second load on Friday. This time he took extreme care. He weighed the empty truck on his neighbor Wes Tamblin's portable platform scale before loading. He recorded the tare weight. He loaded 7,200 pounds from bin 2, a different bin with a different sensor, and confirmed the weight by checking the bin level change against a stick measurement he'd taken that morning. He even ran his handheld moisture meter across 3 grain samples before loading. It read 15.1%. He drove slowly. He didn't stop anywhere. He went straight to Hartfield. The ticket came back at 5,950 pounds, a 1,250-pound discrepancy on a carefully documented load. Caleb sat in the parking lot for a full minute, looking at that number. This wasn't the grain cart. This load had been verified with an external scale before it left the farm. He thought about what his grandfather used to say whenever a number didn't match reality. Dell had a worn brown notebook of his own. He called it his lying detector. And he'd say, "When you can do the common things of life in an uncommon way, you will command the attention of the world." He'd read it somewhere years ago, attributed to George Washington Carver, and he applied it to farming in the simplest possible way. Weigh your grain twice. Write down what you see. A printed number is not a verified truth. Caleb drove home with that thought, sitting heavy in his chest. He started asking around. He wasn't accusatory about it. He'd catch a neighbor at the gas station or pull up alongside someone at the co-op and ask the same quiet question. Do you keep your weigh tickets? Do you write down your cart readings before you deliver? Most people laughed. You trust the elevator, they said. That's what it's for. But Meredith Callie, who ran 200 acres east of Durnland with her husband, pulled an old envelope from her sun visor and handed it over without a word. She'd kept delivery records for 8 years, an old habit from a father who'd once been shorted on soybeans. Caleb compared her records with her Hartfield tickets from the last 3 seasons. The pattern was quiet but unmistakable. In 41 documented loads, Meredith's farm readings were consistently higher than the elevator's tickets, not always by a large margin, but always in the same direction. The average shortfall was about 8.4%, not random noise, a directional lean. Then Caleb talked to Pete Arvello, who farmed north of town. Pete was skeptical, but handed over a shoebox of receipts from the last 5 years. Same direction, similar magnitude. Caleb laid the 3 sets of records side by side on the kitchen table and drew a simple chart in pencil. Delivery date on one axis, percentage discrepancy on the other. Every data point sat on the negative side. Every one. Random scale error scatters. This was doing something else entirely. He called Greer Albright again. This time he brought documentation, his 2 recent loads, the tare weight from Wes Tamblin's scale, the grain cart verification records, and the summary of the 3-farm comparison. He didn't go into the elevator with his voice raised. He brought a folder and sat down across from Greer in the small office that smelled like grain dust and motor oil. Greer's patience narrowed noticeably. He said portable platform scales used by farmers aren't certified commercial equipment. He said comparison records kept by untrained individuals don't constitute evidence of systematic error. He said the elevator's scale had passed its most recent state inspection. All of that was technically true. But Caleb asked one quiet question. If I arrange for an independent certified technician to inspect your system, would you allow it? Greer said he'd have to talk to the regional manager. That answer took 2 weeks to become a yes. The inspection happened on a cold November morning, 22 degrees and clear. A certified scale technician, a methodical woman named Darla Foss, arrived with test weights, calibration equipment, and documentation forms. The elevator's main scale was tested first, with certified reference weights. It passed within normal tolerance. Then Darla examined the elevator's automatic grain sampling and moisture testing unit, the device that pulls grain from incoming loads, measures moisture, and feeds that reading back into the weight calculation system. The unit had been manufactured in 2009. Its last full calibration service was documented in 2019. When Darla ran test samples through it against a handheld certified moisture meter, the discrepancy appeared immediately. The automated unit was reading incoming grain as consistently wetter than it actually was. A grain sample running at actual 15.3% moisture was being logged by the elevator's automated unit at 17.1% moisture. That false moisture reading triggered a larger than warranted shrink deduction on every load that came through. On an 8,400-pound load at true 15.3% moisture, the correct shrink deduction would have been around 110 pounds, but the automated unit was applying a shrink factor based on 17.1% moisture. That calculation produced a deduction of over 1,500 pounds. The math was exact. Darla filed her report. The regional manager arrived within the week. Service records for the automated moisture unit were pulled. It hadn't been independently verified since 2019. 5 harvests. That drift had been compounding quietly, buried inside every ticket printed during that time. The elevator wasn't named in any criminal complaint. There was no evidence of deliberate manipulation, but negligence has its own weight. Caleb's 2 loads were reissued. Meredith and Pete's recent deliveries were reviewed. Letters went out to farmers who'd delivered during the affected period. A correction process began. When Greer Albright came to the Dern farm to discuss the corrected settlement, he sat across from Caleb at that same kitchen table. He was quieter than he'd been on the phone that first morning. The morning he'd told a 17-year-old he'd get a feel for it, with more seasons under his belt. He asked, "How'd you know it was the moisture unit and not the main scale?" Caleb said, "I didn't know. I just knew the shrink number was bigger than it should have been. Everything else checked out. The moisture calculation was the only thing left." Greer nodded slowly. He looked at the green spiral notebook on the table between them, the one Caleb had been keeping since he was 14. He didn't say much else. He didn't need to. 8,400 pounds. That's what went on the truck. That's what left the farm. 6,900 was never the truth. It was a number produced by a machine that hadn't been maintained in 5 years, trusted without question, and printed on enough tickets to add up to something far larger than one teenager's missing 1,500 pounds. The real lesson isn't about one bad piece of equipment. It's about measuring what matters, recording what you measure, and never mistaking a printed number for a verified truth. A farmer doesn't need the newest equipment to protect his livelihood. The most valuable tools Caleb Dern had weren't digital. They were a green spiral notebook, a pencil, a rod for measuring bin levels, and the stubbornness to keep asking when the numbers didn't line up. Write it down, check it twice, and never let a machine's confidence substitute for your own. Because in farming, like in most things, the people who pay the closest attention are the hardest to cheat. If this story made you think twice about the numbers you trust without checking, share it with someone who farms.